We might see Jude as soon as Friday, or I'm hoping actually not till Monday.
Yeah, so Tuesday.
She's doing much better. Great, thank you. Good morning. Today is Thursday, March 30th, 2023. It's 8:35 a.m. and we are taking up work on the topic of anti-degradation. We have a drafting request to walk through, and then we'll take some testimony from interested parties on the whole topic, just to get the topic rolling. There's some complexity and history to it, so today is sort of a deep intro. That's just an introduction, I know, and we will be scheduling more time to dig into it deeper in the coming weeks. With that, good morning, Mr. O'Grady. If you could walk us through the drafting request, that would be great.
This is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Council, as the chair noted. You know, this is a 5-page bill with about 3 pages of findings. It's actually pretty complex, and there's a lot of things moving behind the scenes that you don't see specifically in the bill. I was thinking about how I was going to do this presentation this morning and explain all of this in a coherent way. I decided I was going to come in early and do a PowerPoint presentation, which I finished about 7 minutes ago, maybe. And I didn't even have time to run a spelling check, so you'll see a spelling error on the first page.
Okay, so it's live, fresh material. I mean, we appreciate that. Dynamic, yeah.
So I have some paper copies of the slides if anyone would like to see them, but otherwise I'll just start walking through.
Paper copies are the same as on the
Yeah,
screen.
yeah.
If you have one, I'd love to have a copy of markup. Thank you.
Yeah, I have
Yeah,
more than
please.
I have enough for everyone. if I
Oh,
can.
great. Let's go.
Now, I bet you.
Thank you very much.
You and I are both hard copy through.
So, and there's
I
one
got
there
a
for
copy,
Pete.
I have a shadow one today.
Yeah, there's enough there for.
Thank you very much.
So anyway, what are we talking about? We're talking about 10 VSA 1259D. And right now, 1259D says no person shall cause a discharge of waste into Class A waters except for on-site disposal of sewage from systems with the capacity of 1,000 gallons per day or less that are either exempt from or comply with the environmental protection rules for existing systems, which shall require a permit according to the provisions of 1263F of this title. So on-site disposal usually means on-site wastewater systems or septic, but it says that this has to be permitted under 1263F, which means it's an indirect discharge. So what consequence does that have? Well, typically a 3 to 4 bedroom home needs a septic tank with more than 1,000 gallons per day capacity. Like if you're a 1 to 2 bedroom, you can do 750. If you're 3, you're right around 1,000. If you're like more than that, it's more than 1,000. So you can't get suitable septic in the Class A water here because it says you have to get an indirect discharge.
Sorry, quick question. So indirect discharge means what precisely?
Basically, an indirect discharge is when you are discharging pollutants to the soil, to the surface, and not directly into a conveyance that goes to a point source.
So it could be on the surface or it could be subsurface.
Yes.
Okay. But not flowing or something, is it have to be stopped there?
Well, there was
No
just
roaming.
a case, a U.S. Supreme Court case in Hawaii, where they were indirectly discharging waste into injection wells, and the waste was making its way to the ocean.
All right.
And
San Diego or something.
the discharger was saying, hey, it's an indirect discharge. We don't need a direct discharge permit. And the court said no, because it made its way to the ocean it was, and the discharger knew it. It was a direct discharge, but
And
generally
was,
it was.
Yeah.
But generally under Vermont law, any land application of that discharge needs an indirect discharge permit.
And I guess because ultimately we're talking about pollution or materials traveling into lakes and stuff. So what can an indirect discharge travel on the property, disperse,
What?
move off.
Well, there's a whole rule on an indirect discharge, and you need a permit for that. It's fairly technical rule. And I was gonna explain the differences between, very high level of differences between indirect and on-site.
Okay, thank you.
Um,
You curbed my enthusiasm.
One of the things that 1259D references is the Class A water. What's a Class A water? Well, the state is required to classify its waters according to their water quality value. The statute does that, and you say 1252. So there's two categories of Class A waters. There's Class A1, waters in natural condition that has significant ecological value, and Class A2, waters that are suitable for a public water source with filtration and disinfection or other required treatment character uniformly excellent. You should also note Class B1, waters in which one or more uses are demonstrably and consistently higher quality than Class B waters. So if you're in Class A water, you have to get an indirect discharge for anything in that, and it has to be 1,000 gallons per day or less. That significantly restricts development in the Class A water.
Sorry, what's it?
I don't understand what it means to be in a Class A water.
So you are a activity or construction development, and you require a permit to discharge. You are, and it could be a direct discharge, it could be stormwater flowing off of your impervious surface into that Class A water. We're gonna get to that.
Is it like anywhere in the watershed?
It can be, yes.
Okay. So if you're in the watershed of a Class A water, then you are in a Class A water.
You're in a Class A.
Okay.
If you're gonna do an activity that needs that permit in that Class A water.
Okay. Sorry, I was thinking about like boats are in the water. I don't understand. So, okay, that I feel more clear about it now. Thanks.
Can wait.
Thank you, Chair Bright. Is there a map of this?
The agency knows what's Class A and what's Class B. The maps, I think, are by basin, aren't they?
They're by basin, but they also call out, we do have maps available online that show that there must be another.
And that would be on the ANR website?
On the ANR
atlas. Okay, I will take a look, because I have 3 rivers, multiple ponds.
That would be very interesting.
There are streams that are currently Class A, yeah, but not lakes.
And just so that for people who are watching, I wonder who's in the audience chipping in, if you can just identify yourself.
I'm sorry, Chair Bright. I'm Pete LaFlamme, Director of the Watershed Management Division at Vermont DEC.
And I'm Bethany Sargent. I'm the Monitoring and Assessment Program Manager at Vermont DEC.
Okay.
All right, so why is indirect an issue, and what would be the option? Well, the option would be on-site wastewater. And on-site wastewater is professionally engineered and designed, and are technically issues the permit, but I should say PE certification is the key regulatory condition. It can be expensive depending on the site conditions, but Vermont industry is experienced and can adjust to most situations. There's no permit term. Once it's installed, you don't need to renew that permit unless the system fails. But in indirect discharge, you need a permit from ANR under the indirect discharge rule. It can be fairly technical. There are significant conditions. Has a permit term of 5 years. It must be renewed or discharge must stop. If law changes after the permit is issued, discharge may be subject to new conditions in a renewed permit. And the 1,000 capacity in Class A applies to indirect. So really, indirect discharge permits are not being issued for development in Class A waters, and on-site is not available. So
PR certification is what again?
it should say PE certification,
Oh, okay.
professional engineer. Again, I
That's okay.
didn't.
I just thought maybe I needed to learn another acronym.
And so what is draft 23-1011 doing, proposing? It's proposing that for all those waters that are for discharges of waste into Class A waters that were classified as Class A before July 1, 2023, except for on-site disposal from systems with capacity or less, they still need to get that indirect discharge. So Class A before July 1, you have to get the indirect discharge. That's what it says. And then for all other waters, on-site disposal of wastewater from a system with capacity of less than 6,500 gallons per day may be permitted within a Class A or Class B water, provided the system complies with the permitting requirements described in Chapter 64 of this title. That means it gets an on-site wastewater system currently.
And is it fair for them to say that the demands of an on-site wastewater permit system, it's a higher level of functionality than a system that gets permitted with an indirect discharge permit? Like,
I wouldn't say it's just a higher functionality. It's you're moving from 1,000 gallon limit, which is restrictive, to the 6,500, which is the standard under A&R's on-site rules right now. And don't be under the impression that the on-site rules are easy.
Yeah.
They're not easy, and they're not necessarily cheap. But this will allow for a 4-bedroom home, right? Because 1,000 gallons per day isn't really gonna be suitable for a 4-bedroom home. But on-site wastewater up to 6,500 will be.
If you were building 3 bedrooms and you need 750 gallons a day.
Well, 3 bedrooms is like right at that 1,000.
Okay, 2.
Right.
So,
Two.
whatever, well, something well below 1,000, but could you would need to have an indirect discharge permit currently if you're in a Class A role.
That's correct.
And it's renewed every 5 years. Does it cover a septic system? So although the other one's called wastewater, with an indirect discharge permit,
I mean-
allow you to build septic.
You should probably talk to Bethany about exactly what they permit as indirect discharges, but they are two different things.
But I'm just trying to understand if they, from the point
You
of
should
view
talk
of
to
septic.
Bethany about
Okay.
that.
All right, well, thanks. Then what?
Thank you, Chair Bray. I'm a little behind the times. I'm brand new to this committee. I'm trying to follow along. Is the hope here that we are doing some kind of legislative change on this? What am I meant to be fully absorbing? Because it's a
Right,
very
there
big
is
subject.
a proposed draft bill that the chair asked to be drafted as a
And
committee
it's
bill.
this one right here.
Yeah, DR 23-1011.
Okay. And you're explaining to us
I'm explaining
the
like,
problem
what-
that we're experiencing.
and what is being proposed and what is not seen in this bill.
Okay,
Because there's a lot of things that are not seen that are going on behind the background in this bill.
okay. So this is just a primer understanding.
That's just we're ready to
Big
provide
topic.
context, because the bill is so narrow, it's really hard to see what else would you want to know as you think about this skinny little bill?
Okay, well,
And that's this.
that helps me because I don't know if I will become a watershed expert. And
I don't expect anyone to really understand what the heck is going on in this bill until you have a few days of testimony
Okay,
and
Gonna
hear
absorb.
from Bethany and Pete and Hannah and the Green Riders and all that. So,
Be an iterative learning process.
beautiful.
Okay, thank you for helping. It's gonna be painful to field our questions, because we're gonna ask oddball questions.
So-
Quite well phrased.
So what is being proposed is to allow for that wastewater system of up to 6,500 gallons in that Class A water. And that changes the indirect discharge section as well to allow for that. But why? Why? And how does the water, that Class A water, still remain Class A and still be protected? And what you will see in the findings of the draft bill is that the A&R anti-degradation implementation rule shall also clarify how proposed new discharges to state water will be reviewed and permitted by A&R. That the rule shall require consideration of cumulative impacts, including like multiple residential permitted wastewater systems to the receiving water during evaluation of any proposed discharge. And then pursuant to that rule, A&R shall require a site-specific Tier 2 analysis, which is part of that rule, for the use of individual permits to ensure the protection of waters that are Class A, B1, or A2, where the Secretary determines water quality data meets or exceeds the minimum criteria for these classes, or waters for which the Secretary has received a complete reclassification petition. Proposed activities may result in a measurable reduction in physical, chemical, or biological quality of such water. What does that mean? You probably don't know.
You're right.
And so let's talk about what this is. Anti-degradation. What is the anti-degradation? Well, the Clean Water Act Federal Clean Water Act requires states to include in their water quality standards an anti-degradation policy. They've had that requirement, some will argue, since the 1960s, but it's really since 1980, right about 1980. And Vermont does have an anti-degradation policy. It's in the state water quality standards. Generally, it says all water shall be managed in accordance with these rules to protect, maintain, and improve water quality. Protect, maintain, and improve water quality. You do not get to degrade water. So anti-degradation. You protect, maintain, and improve. You do not degrade the water quality. So that's the anti-degradation. What that means is that existing uses of water, the level of water quality necessary to protect those existing uses shall be maintained and protected regardless of the water's classification. So what the use is for, it's a Class A use, it has to maintain the Class A use. It's a Class A B use, they have to maintain all the uses in that. And you can't degrade the water so those uses are no longer available. And determination of what constitute existing uses shall be made either during the planning process, the basin planning process, or on a case-by-case basis during consideration of an application. So when somebody is applying for a permit for an activity in the water, you look at what it's classified as, you look at what its uses are, you look at its water quality, and then you have to determine whether or not that proposed activity is going to maintain, protect, and improve that water quality and does not degrade that water quality.
Senator McCormick.
Don't we actually degrade water all the time?
So you are allowed to discharge to water if that discharge doesn't affect the uses of that water. So it doesn't basically eliminate the existing use of that water. And there are ways that discharges can do that. There are multiple limitations in statute and rule. There are controls that can be used so that a discharge is allowed and it does not degrade the water and does not affect the existing uses.
You said and. It does not degrade the water and it does not affect the uses.
You are manage these waters to protect, maintain, and improve those water qualities, and their uses. And you have to protect those uses and maintain them. Except get to that in a minute.
Everybody?
Thank you, Chair Bray. You mentioned improve the water.
Right, so if you're gonna have a use that somehow is gonna have a beneficial effect on the water.
What would an example of that be?
For example, part of some of the activities that are going to be permitted are stormwater under the state stormwater.
Okay.
So say somebody wants to develop and they need a stormwater permit. There are actually stormwater controls that will reduce sediment that's running off of existing undeveloped land. So it will improve the water for purposes of.
Okay, so it's not, that's really interesting. I hadn't envisioned that. But you wouldn't, there's no like septic system that people can put in that would be, there's nothing like that that we've somehow found can actually have a positive.
That's a question for these two people behind me.
Okay, I will hold that question.
Whether or not they've actually, some reverse discharge beneficial, I don't know.
But the law allows, if you got water that's swimmable, that's an activity.
You have to maintain that swimmable
You have to
use.
still, are you in compliance with the law if what you have done, the water is still swimmable, though perhaps not quite so pleasant?
You have to maintain all of those uses and you have to do it in a way that, again, it protects, maintains, and improves the water quality. Like how the agency does that and with what fine criteria is something that I don't do it day to day. Those two people behind me do it day to day.
I mean, nature changes. I live on the White River. In May, the White River is a gift from God. In August, you can still swim in it, but it's really kind of murky, not so pleasant. Now that happens naturally with the gym. Okay, what if a development makes it? It can still swim in it, but it's not the same.
I don't know if you just asked me a question.
Yeah. Have you degraded the water? You've changed it chemically, but you can still do the same use.
I don't know how has it been changed chemically?
So you'd have to do like a lot of testing.
Well, maybe it has more bacteria in it. It has more.
So
Organic matter
that's
floating.
not supposed to be, if you're going to be a development that's contributing more bacteria to the water so that it affects the use of that water, that's not supposed to be allowed.
Okay, that's my question. Thanks.
Unless, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Unless it's, I have a feeling we're gonna have to tolerate a certain amount of fuzziness and make more than one pass through this.
So the state has a policy on anti-degradation, but EPA also requires states to have a process for how the anti-degradation policy is implemented. Arguable whether or not the state currently has that process. Statute requires the agency to adopt that process by rule by 2016. For 2016, it was 2008. For 2008, it was 2005. The agency still does not have that rule.
So the first what set that 2005 was
The General Assembly did because the agency had not adopted it yet. I say arguably that the state doesn't have one because instead of adopting a rule, the agency adopted a procedure on anti-degradation implementation. So if you can't go through it, you go around it. And that's effectively what the agency did. They did it because there was language that said that they shouldn't file the rule until a date in the future because the General Assembly was concerned what that rule was going to include. And so General Assembly is partly at fault for delaying the rule itself. But we had the procedure, but now there's a proposed implementation. Why the rule is being offered now after 20 odd years, I don't know. It's probably the EPA overlords or the Green Riders or probably the A&R staff themselves probably think it's necessary at this point as well.
Who are the green guys?
It's like the environmental
Oh,
activists. They're a cabal now. They like ride together.
got good snacks or something.
So what? So what if the anti-degradation implementation rule passes or is enacted? Well, it's in the findings pursuant to the draft 231011. Pursuant to the rule, A&R shall require site-specific tier 2 analysis for the use of individual permits to ensure protection of Class A water. They will make sure that the proposed activities that need a permit will not degrade water quality of A1, B1, or A2. And they'll do it through individual permits, not general permits. And they will determine whether or not the water quality meets or exceeds the minimum requirements for those criteria. And unless there's a petition for reclassification that may result in measurable reduction, that would allow for basically a different analysis. So this will also allow reclassification of Class B waters to Class A waters, while also allowing for development in those waters. Because right now, nobody's going to classify something that qualifies as Class A from Class B to Class A if they're considering or contemplating development in that watershed, because you can't really do it because of the 1,000 gallon per day limit on indirect. So this will allow for that reclassification. So think about it. Theoretically, you take away kind of an arbitrary 1,000 gallon per day limit in statute. You still have a rule that requires significant environmental rule, the on-site wastewater, that allows for greater development. And overlaid on top of that rule is the anti-degradation implementation rule that is intended to ensure that the water is not degraded and is protected. And you get to reclassify waters that are currently B and could go to A so that they could get greater protection while still allowing development in that water. It seems like a win-win-win-win, right? Maybe. And so you get it. It does do all of those things that I just said, but the rule hasn't been adopted yet. You have a draft, but you don't know exactly what it will require. And you know, LTAR is like the shooting gallery, and anything can happen in there. It's only 8 people. You know, they can do a bunch of stuff in there.
Yeah, I think we have at least 2, a good
If you can do
percentage.
that, you can do that.
Yeah, that's all you do.
You can't amend or anything like that.
And there's no requirement or condition that A&R reclassify Class B waters that qualify as Class A. I mean, that's kind of like the agency wants to call this bill a bill relating to reclassification of waters, even though reclassification isn't even mentioned in the substance of the bill at all. There's no requirement, no condition on there's nothing in the bill about reclassification. So is there any accountability for that? And then there's no requirement in statute or rule to document the anti-degradation analysis, as far as I can tell, including what's called the socioeconomic impact analysis. And that's the unless. And so under anti-deg, you can't degrade the water quality. You need to protect or maintain that water quality unless you do what's called the socioeconomic impact analysis, which looks at all the economic impacts and other impacts, including environmental justice impacts of a proposed activity looking for a permit. And it effectively allows for a balancing of that economic impact versus the potential degradation that activity would have. And it allows the secretary to say, hey, in this situation, because of the significant economic impact and the minimal degradation of the water, the agency is going to allow that activity, even though it does have some minimal degradation of the water. So that's the unless.
Which secretary?
Send it down.
What?
Which secretary?
Secretary of Natural Resources. I want to be clear that the socioeconomic impact analysis is not an easy thing. It's not an easy thing. There's a long list of criteria. There's going to be a ton of interested persons in that. It's not going to be easy for the agency to do that on a regular basis, but it's a possibility. I'm not sure if anti-DEG is actually required for on-site wastewater, because it's not one of the permits listed in the anti-DEG implementation.
Say that again. It's a draft.
So the anti-degradation implementation rule, which is, I think it just closed for public comment about a month ago, right? It lists what permit activities it's going to apply to. It doesn't list on-site wastewater. So this draft says the agency is going to do a tier 1 analysis for any activity in a class 1 water. Does that not include the on-site wastewater system? I don't know. I also want to say that all those buts, all those issues that I just laid out, they're all addressable. They're all addressable either in the rule or in statute. You can address all of them. I think theoretically what the bill is intended to do, it theoretically does. In practice, I think you need to maybe have a little bit of faith in the agency and implementation of the anti-DEG implementation rule. And then I think you can build in some accountability for classification, accountability for documentation of the anti-degradation analysis, and then clarification about whether anti-DEG is going to apply to on-site wastewater.
Great, thank you for that.
I'll probably be back on this bill.
It's like a combination of 60,000 feet and 10,000 feet. I know there's lower altitude still to eventually.
And I've got to run.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for the introduction. So we're. You have a question? Yeah,
Real perennial question.
Yeah. I think,
Child race. On how is an on-site wastewater defined? And what is not considered to be on-site wastewater?
yep, all right, so we'll dig into that. Mr. Grady had to go. He stayed a little long because they're putting a bill out in another committee and he's the drafter.
Well, those are
But we will have,
understood, he's gotta go.
yeah, just, we'll have him back for sure. All right.
And then the third question is, sometimes you structure a thing and then at the bottom you say, and Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith, or Mrs. Smith are exempt from having to behave in accordance with the above. Are there any of those things in what we're looking
Oh,
at?
in here.
Such things.
Well, we'll keep, this is definitely gonna be an iterative process. So with that, I'd like to invite the team A&R to speak with us, and you can pull a third chair up You know, you want to have Ms. Smith with you or
I can stay here.
stay there? Okay.
I'll jump in as necessary.
So thank you for coming and I think rather, we didn't get to walk through the bill, but let's go through whatever you want to share with us and we'll sort of wash over it more than one time. I know that already we all have questions, but we also know it's going to take a little bit to get all the details. Good morning. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. Thanks, Chairman Bray. For the record, again, my name is Peter Flom. I'm Director of the Watershed Management Division at Vermont DEC, and I'm with
Bethany Sargent. I'm the Monitor and Assessment Program Manager at Vermont DEC.
and
I'm Hannah Smith. I'm an attorney with DEC.
and wanted to thank you for the opportunity to come this morning and talk to you about this, which we see as a really important opportunity. And this initiative came about as part of our anti-degradation implementation procedure stakeholder group. And you'll be hearing from several members of that group later today. There are several members of the group in the room. In addition, I think you'll be hearing from Jeff Nelson and Warren Coleman, who are also part of that group. This group, we met for 8 discrete long meetings over the course of about 14 months to discuss this concept. It's, as you could tell from Mike O'Grady's overview, it's an incredibly complicated topic, although seemingly simple on the surface. And so this morning, we wanted to walk through a bit of what we did in the anti-degradation implementation group. But then we really feel like it's important to understand sort of the interplay between our water quality standards, reclassification, permitting, and the anti-degradation implementation rule. So we'll see if we can pull that off this morning. The Vermont water quality standards to start with, and we're just going to touch on these subjects lightly. I would be happy, of course, to answer any questions you have. As Chair Bray said, I think it will be an iterative process because there's a ton of material to go through. But the Vermont water quality standards really form the basis of our work at the agency and our division to protect, maintain, enhance, and restore Vermont surface waters. That's the mission of the Watershed Management Division. The water quality standards, as Mike talked about, set forth different classes of water based upon their relative quality when it comes to chemical, physical, and biological characteristics. So we measure those characteristics and we slot waters. We have the opportunity to slot waters as different classes. And there are really the 4 different classes that Mike O'Grady spoke of: B2, B1, A2, and A1. Classifying their waters based upon their existing water quality condition is really critical to effectively protecting and maintaining them. Classification determinations should be made solely upon the water quality data. The management implications or regulatory restrictions should be considered separately and differently as part of our permitting process, not part of reclassification, which is where this prohibition currently lies. And that's where the linkage to the proposed anti-degradation rule comes in. The consideration of the location, the size, and the scale, as Senator Watson asked a few moments ago, it really is the watershed that we're managing that drains to. So the watershed is the area of land that drains to the particular classified water. So within an A1 watershed, the watershed is what we're talking about, and really activities in those watersheds should be evaluated again based upon their location, size, and scale relative to the size of the watershed. These watersheds can be large. They can be tens and tens of square miles large. And so there are a number of possible activities within that particular watershed that would not have necessarily an impact on water quality. That evaluation should take place as part of the permitting process. So I mentioned anti-degradation and Mike talked some about it. We're going to do a shallow dive into anti-degradation now. Again, it was the topic of a very long and I think successful stakeholder process to come up with a proposed rule that we currently have. As Mike said, we've been in the rulemaking process. We've gone through ITAR, we've gone through the announcement of it, we've gone through the public notice and comment period. We're currently working on response to comments, and then the final step will be going to LCAR. The anti-deg policy, so there are two things that involve anti-degradation. It's a policy within our Vermont water quality standards, and then there's also the implementation procedure. So I'm going to turn to Bethany to talk a little bit more about the procedure and what it does.
So as Pete had mentioned, and as Mr. O'Grady had described in his presentation, anti-degradation limits the water quality degradation that results when there's a new discharge to a high quality water. And there's a few terms that are somewhat technical in nature that I want to make sure that you understand. So high quality is one of those, and the water quality standards based upon the class of the water set that minimum water quality. And if the surface water meets or exceeds that minimum water quality for its class, it's considered high quality. And that can be for a B2 class, which is the default class for our waters in Vermont. All waters above 2,500 feet are class A. Those waters below 2,500 feet, unless expressly reclassified, are class B2. And that's considered sort of the basic or the lowest class of water quality. So the anti-deg analysis, again, is analysis that's done during the permitting process. And there's a few steps in that. First, you ask the question, you look at the receiving water, so the water that would potentially be impacted by what's being proposed. And you ask, is this water high quality? Does it meet or exceed the minimum water quality criteria for its class? And then you ask, okay, if it is a high quality water, then you proceed down the anti-deg pathway. And you say, well, how high is it above that minimum criteria? And what is the proposed activity's impact on that water quality? So the anti-degradation limits how much degradation can occur above that minimum criteria for its class. Otherwise, we would be permitting activities down to the minimum. So we want to grudgingly allow, based on, as Mr. O'Grady explained, a socioeconomic analysis. So how much would it cost, as an example? What are the socioeconomic impacts to allow that little bit of lowering above the minimum criteria? So that's what we would consider sort of a site-specific analysis.
Wow.
That's a good question. Would you ever allow enough impact that an A1 would be downgraded to A2?
No. So in the thing of, our classes aren't particularly straightforward in that an A1 doesn't become an A2. So A2 is this anomaly that exists for waters that, with treatment could be used as a public water source. There are many public water sources that aren't A2s. It's sort of a relic of the classification system. So this conversation would be most useful, I think, focused on A1 and then B1, which is the next sort of lower class, and then B2.
But to answer the question, we're not allowed to go below. It's against the anti-degradation procedure. It's against the law, frankly, to go below and eliminate existing uses.
And
so that's the minimum. The floor for any particular class is the absolute minimum. What anti-deg does is limit, under only certain circumstances, limit any downward movement towards that floor. But we never can go below the floor. That's one of the three tiers, if you will, in anti-deg speak. The tier 1 protection is you're never allowed to go below that minimum criteria to imperil, as Michael Grady was talking about, to imperil that special set of uses unique to that particular class.
Can I sorry, this is Hannah Smith. This goes directly to Senator McCormick's question.
Mm-hmm.
If a water is swimmable, if that's a use that's currently available in the water, what we're discussing now speaks directly to your question. Certain potential discharges might be allowed that would lower water quality within that assimilative capacity, but you could never eliminate the use.
Okay, so
and our water quality standards and the water quality criteria are what we evaluate as sort of the measuring stick, right? In terms of how much a project may impact water quality.
Is there a chart of all the different classifications and what they are allowed within each? And where would I find that? Because I'm trying to follow along with A1, A2, swimmable, not swimmable, drinkable, not drinkable. Where are these and is there a chart I can look at?
They live in our water quality standards, and the classes are based on those, what we call designated uses. So those are the values that the water needs to support. And so for each designated use, we have specific criteria. So for example, for aquatic biota, we have a specific criteria, and that all lives within the water quality standard.
And where would I find that?
You can find a link online. So under the DEC webpage, there's a webpage for the water quality standards specifically. So the standards, like many rules, we're happy.
Yeah, that would be,
Yeah.
that would be, because I'm trying.
It's not a chart,
It's
Oh,
not a
it's not a
chart,
chart.
nor is it a user-friendly document,
No.
but there, like
Okay.
many rules. But there are some fact sheets on there that might help interpret them.
Okay.
Senator Watson.
Thank you. So similar question along the same lines. You're thinking about the criteria that are involved in determining whether it's a high quality water or how high quality it is. Could you, just for example, could you say like what kinds of things are in those criteria? Because I'm picturing, you know, biological criteria as well as chemical, you know, are we talking about phosphorus? Are we talking like, what are we, you know, is it concentrations? Like, what are we talking about?
That's exactly right. For index, you're exactly right. For index for each use, each designated use, there's a specific set of criteria specific to that use, as Senator McCormick was saying earlier about bacteria. So bacteria levels are indexed to contact recreation use. Phosphorus is indexed to the aquatic biota use, and other uses, the aesthetic use. So for each of the uses, there are criteria which we use to be able to assess whether or not we're meeting that particular use. And for different classes, those criteria change. They become, you would imagine, more stringent for the higher classes. So to assess whether a water fits in a particular class, we would go out and measure the criteria, whether they're chemical, physical, or biological criteria, and then be able to slot that and then use those criteria to assess any impacts from a particular permit as to whether, you know, what effect that would have relative to that particular set of uses. And there are several uses. There are how many in total? About 8. Yeah.
And just to follow up, so I imagine, especially if there are multiple criteria, that it may, you know, I'm thinking about like how I grade papers or whatever, you know, like that there may be different indicators. That's like I might use a rubric, and that some things don't
Great
fit
analogy.
cleanly into one category, another or another. You know what I mean? Like, well, it's one measurement on one category, you know, it's high quality in this way, but it's, you know,
That's
it's not in this other way. And
I can provide a more concrete example in terms of how we evaluate the aquatic biota and wildlife use in streams. So we have our biocriteria within the water quality standards where we look at 2 community types. We look at the macroinvertebrates or the bugs in the stream, and we look at the fish community in the stream. And so each one of those tells us something a little bit different about the condition. And when we're evaluating, does it meet this class? We need to have 2 bioassessments, so we can't just go out and measure it once. And we need both communities to be excellent in order to classify it as A1.
Okay.
And we do sometimes get, you know, one year it might be very good, 1 year it might be excellent, and that wouldn't necessarily.
okay.
So we have very explicit ways that we evaluate that and understand that they're not always gonna agree. It's an ecosystem and it can be complex.
Are you, do you have a complete inventory of all the waters in the state? And then you make a regular pass around to like monitor where they all are?
It would be wonderful to have the capacity to measure every surface water in the state, but we unfortunately don't. But we do have a way that we prioritize where we want monitor. And one of the opportunities that we see is we do have a lot of data that indicates that streams, that there are streams that are currently B2 that meet either A1 or B1. So we have data on around 125 streams right now that we could reclassify. And we have data on, for 11 lakes, and it's a little bit different in lakes in that we're evaluating a different designated use than aquatic biota. And so we're looking at nutrient concentrations over a 5-year period to evaluate a lake's attainment of a higher class.
So I have a question. There's no implicit criticism. If I don't know how many lakes, ponds, streams there are to monitor, but can you give us a sense of, if you measure at some point in time the qualities of half of them, 100% of them? It takes a while to get back to them. Like
That's a great
I
question. Yeah, so there's roughly, and I want to say it's 10 acres and greater for lakes, around 800, and feel free to chime in, and around 23,000 miles of streams. So we
Monitoring activities this year.
we roughly get to 120 sites in a year. And so the way that we choose sites, we would measure the aquatic biota at that particular site, and depending upon what is occurring upstream. So one of the wonderful things about measuring the aquatic biota is that they're great integrators of everything that's coming from upstream. And so we can say if the aquatic biota are excellent downstream site, that the stream, upstream of that, unless there's, some, that would be class A as well, for example.
Thank you, Chair Bray. This is like a whole new world again to me. So I'm trying to understand two things now. So you're saying that right now there are streams that could meet the A1 criteria, but you have not tested them, or you can't confirm that they would in fact go up to the A1 standard. So that means, if I'm understanding correctly, your point is that there are things that are being allowed to happen in those streams, and because they are not being reclassified, they're going to remain, I assume, at the B, they're going to remain at the B2 level, and they'll never actually be fully protected in the way that we would want, like an actual A1 level to be protected. Is that the
So we have data right now that demonstrates that these 125 streams could be reclassified.
Okay.
And so that is, our understanding, and until they're reclassified. So one of the benefits of reclassification is it sets the floor. This is where we get back to anti-degradation, where we can never go below that minimum criteria. And so to get back to the proposal that we're discussing today in terms of the prohibition and how anti-degradation fits in there, what we're proposing in the anti-degradation rule, even taken, is, we feel, a much better way to protect these waters than what's in the existing anti-deg implementation procedure combined with this prohibition. So a reminder that what is proposed is looking forward, and that right now the proposal would only impact those waters that are presently B2, because there's no, and there's no existing prohibition for those now. So they're in the streams that I mentioned, or in the watersheds that I mentioned for these streams. There are systems that are 1,000 gallons or greater. There are indirect systems that are greater than 6,500 gallons. Not many, but there are some. And so what we would like to do is instead require for all applicable permits for the anti-deg implementation rule, the requirement to do that site-specific evaluation for not only the A1 waters, which is the focus of the prohibition, but also the B1 waters, because those are what we term very high quality.
Okay, and that's okay. So the wheels are moving. I'm starting to understand. Do you have a list of these streams?
Yes.
Okay, that would be awesome to see. And then one other question, you reclassified a bog in Heartland?
So
we had a whole conversation about this. Is this related to that? No, it's a completely different conversation. Okay,
There's a very similar parallel system for our wetland protection. And
okay,
we have our different classes of wetland. Class 2 wetlands or wetlands of significance that the state issues permits for activities within. Class 1 wetlands or wetlands of very, very high quality in the state, where there's a separate process under the Vermont wetland rules, which are a parallel rule specific to that resource, to the water quality standards that function primarily, although water quality standards do govern also activities in wetlands, particularly those with the water column. There's a cross linkage between our water quality standards and the Vermont wetland rules, but the water quality standards primarily are applied in streams and lakes.
okay. So just to be very clear, the changes that you're recommending would not have create a situation like what happened in Heartland, or
Correct.
because
That-
they're a wetland and not like a stream or a pond or
Correct.
something. Okay,
um,
okay,
Evaluation of wetlands, protection of wetlands, and then classification of wetlands to a class 1 wetland potentially occur under the Vermont wetland rules. There are some similarities, but a different.
but it's a different, and that's not what we're working on today.
Exactly.
Okay,
Right. Chairman Carl.
I might understand more clearly with the before and after. What is the situation now? What will the situation be after the bill passes? And how do they differ?
That's a great question.
Right now, there is the provision in the statute that we're suggesting should be reevaluated, that carries with it the requirement for a prohibition of system greater than 1,000 gallons per day for A1 waters. And it acts as it has a chilling effect on reclassification. And we're suggesting that with the advent of the new anti-degradation rule and the provisions and the protections within it, that this would be an excellent opportunity to remove the prohibition from statute, to allow us to reclassify waters based upon their characteristic. That's what reclassification should be about, and remove this existing prohibition, which really doesn't have a good nexus to protection of waters. 1,000-gallon limit is somewhat a random limit. Remove that and instead use the process that we've set up through the stakeholder process and in the rule to protect these A1 waters, to protect them more comprehensively, of not having this a priori prohibition against 1,000-gallon systems or more in these watersheds. So that's the proposal.
Can you explain a little bit the chilling effect that, like the property rights issue or the concern of citizens in areas affected?
There are certainly both of those things, Chair Bray. Yes, there are concerns over property owners. Again, these watersheds can be fairly large. They can be tens of square miles, particularly when it comes to some of the lakes. This outright prohibition of systems greater than 1,000 gallons per day raises concerns in the community. It raises concerns with property owners. It precludes the potential for retrofit systems that might involve 2 or 3 houses with failing systems, constructing a much more modern retrofit system within these watersheds. It exists without any clear nexus to water quality, given the current permitting regime for indirect systems. If, in some cases, it might be accurate in a situation of, say, a 2,000 gallon per day system that's in a watershed that's class A, but far away from that water. And there's a set of, environmental characteristics that's going to preclude any impact from that system on the water. That prohibition currently exists. And again, it's a prohibition in reclassification. Reclassification should be based upon the water's characteristics.
Sure. And if I'm in a B1 watershed, what are the rules around septic and, size and limits?
There is no prohibition
Right,
for B1
Okay. So
presently.
if I'm a homeowner and I'm in a place with no limits, and then I hear that my great pond that I'd love to see as an A1 could be reclassified, so I know that it was going to be better protected going forward. But I'm gonna, now the whole watershed will be subject to this 1,000-gallon limit. I I might have concerns that I can't build another bedroom or whatever it is.
That's exactly right. And again, we would evaluate in this proposal, in the anti-deg implementation rule, we would evaluate potential impacts across all of our permitting types to protect and maintain that higher class water. Those waters, as you just said, Chair Bright, currently are B2 waters, and they enjoy no such protection. They enjoy basic fundamental anti-degradation protection, but at that lower threshold, that lower floor, if you will, of B2. We would like to elevate that floor.
Sure. Senator Watson, you have a question?
I do. Curious if this prohibition on reclassification exists for wetlands.
Wetlands, again, are a different,
Right, I know
different
they're,
situation, but there is, for a class 1 wetland, there is a set of very, very strict restrictions on, essentially the only activities that could go on in a class 1 wetland are those necessary for public health and safety. So those wetlands are set aside and protected, absolutely.
but if something were to be better, that reclassification is easier for wetlands rather than, no, it's not, okay.
No,
Oh, okay.
I wouldn't say
Okay.
it's easier. It's different. I wouldn't say it's easier.
Okay, that's good to know.
Both are done through the rulemaking
Yes.
process.
Okay,
Wetlands are reclassified to class 1 through an amendment to wetland rules. The highest quality waters are reclassified to class A through an amendment to water quality standards.
okay,
So both go through a rigorous process that involves, review of ample data
Yeah.
related to the water
okay,
and a public process associated with rulemaking.
okay, wow, all right. It's good to know, just sort of like how this fits into that bigger picture. Thanks.
I have a quick question, because I can't write fast enough sometimes. Are there roughly, so on your list of could reclassify, 125, approximately 125 streams and about how many?
11.
11. And so can you send the committee a list of the existing
Certainly.
list? And so if this change were, if the rule that implemented the statute that complements it were to pass, I'm presupposing that, but if it were, what would happen next? Like, what happens next? So you have this like sort of a to-do list or wish list for places to go reclassify.
Yeah, so first of all, the idea of that is very exciting. We've been sitting on this, we have this data and focused a great deal over the last several years on how we might protect these watersheds when reclassified. So knowing that the anti-deg rule is in process with with a mechanism by which we can protect these waters and that we have this data, we would, during our next triennial rulemaking, so we would have this list, let me take one step back and say we would have this list of waters. And our anti-deg rule, because we've established this list of waters, would require these protections of these waters. And then during our next update to the water quality standards rule, which we'd have to do at least once every 3 years, we would propose that these waters be reclassified through that rulemaking process, which would again set that floor at that new level of either A1 or B1.
So the protections would come into effect immediately for any permitting that would go on in these waters prior to going into rulemaking, and then rulemaking at most at a 3-year interval would then evaluate and provide permanently that protection for these waters. So we would have both more or less a provisional protection and then, move those waters, commit to move those waters into formal rulemaking to put that protection on.
And if I could just add, so we have, the dozens of waters that we have data on now. So once we've got through that initial rulemaking process, there would be fewer waters each year because, as I mentioned, we get to roughly 120 sites a year. And so we would do that incrementally. So every, for each iteration of the water quality standards, we would, sweep through, evaluate what waters meet this higher class And then we would be reclassifying those with each new set of standards.
So I'm trying to remember from Elkhart time, it sounds a little odd when you say that in order to classify, you're gonna go through rulemaking. But am I remembering this right? So you're doing a revision of the Vermont Water Quality Standards every 3 years. There's like an appendix.
There is appendix
In the
F.
back, and it's a list of waters, and I don't know if it's all by class or.
It's a list of those waters that are anything but B2. So because B2 is sort of our default classification, this list is exclusive to those waters that are A1, A2. We don't have any B1, so there aren't any B1 in there now, but we would.
Okay, so if the water graduates to this higher level, we'll see it as a part of the appendix
Yes.
on the next water quality standard
Yes.
iteration. Where are you in the triennial cycle?
We just wrapped up with the 2022 water quality standards rule, although we're already beginning to work on our next update to the standards. It takes considerable thought in terms of what changes we'll be seeking. And so, yeah, I would envision that we would initiate the rule-making process in another year and a half.
In order to be able to stay with that triennial cycle, because as you know, the rulemaking process in and of itself takes a while, but then there's also the important pre-rulemaking process where we involve stakeholder group, we evaluate changes coming down from EPA, some of the criteria. For example, this most recent time, we updated the aluminum criteria, copper criteria. These were both things that come down from EPA, so-called 304A criteria changes. So we stay current with the latest national requirements. We also tweaked local requirements. We had some changes to those this time as well. And in addition to the reclassification efforts too. So it's a large collection of things moving through rulemaking, all highly technical.
And for any of these 125 streams, log ponds, do you have to do public outreach and notice that you would like to reclassify? And can you remind us of what happens when you pick something off your list? Then what happens?
Currently, the process involves going out to the community and engaging the community, having local public meetings around this, both in pre-rulemaking and then also obviously in the rulemaking itself. But again, with that 1,000-gallon prohibition, as you can imagine, those rule making meetings can become contentious and can be divisive in a community because different community members feel different ways, whether they're in the watershed or outside the watershed. We feel that we could make the process much more efficient and effective if we could have that singular focus on the water quality. Going out then and assessing and meeting with the community as to the actual quality of the water. Is it or isn't it a class B1, class A1? And keep that focus there rather than the contentiousness that arises around what will this prohibition be in this community, in this watershed. Again, we really feel like separating those two things into protection based upon proposed permitting decisions in those watersheds through a permitting process designed to protect the reclassification. So now we go out and we receive a lot of comments on, the prohibition, more so than does the water actually meet the criteria. We would like to be able to have reclassification be more specific to that particular issue.
So in the end, we're really moving towards permitting based on performance criteria rather than relying on a gallonage requirement, just sort of precluding development beyond 1,000 gallons.
That's exactly right.
With reclassifications moving forward.
Right.
So that prohibition would stay for those waters that are currently class A.
So, okay, great. Senator McCormick, you were patient, thank you.
Do we reclassify upwards?
Correct.
Do we reclassify downward?
No.
The only way to do a downward reclassification, it involves EPA, heavy oversight with EPA, as you can imagine, but it's called a use attainability analysis, and you have to be able to prove the case that you could never attain this particular use in this watershed. And as you can imagine, that's a really difficult part of clear, particularly when there are existing uses that have been proven over time. So if a water falls below a particular floor or classification level, then it's declared to be impaired. And we have to develop a plan, restoration plan called the TMDL, to be able to elevate it back up into its designated class. There are very few UAAs, use sustainability analysis done nationally. I'm not aware of any that have ever been done in Region 1. They're very rare for next to impossible, I would say.
Okay. Before continuing, there's a question about Black Gum Swamp, and I don't want to walk us into this swamp too far, but could you just give us a little update on that, please?
Sure, it's one of our potential class 1 wetlands. It's a wetland question, so it would be under the wetland rules, but it's a potential class 1 wetland down in southeastern Vermont that meets the criteria, but because of the management restrictions that come in the wetland rules, not what we're talking about here at all, but there are, as I mentioned earlier, some fairly severe limitations on what could go on in a class 1 wetland. Essentially only activities that are necessary for public health and safety. No other permitting would take place as it would in a class, as the potential would be in a class 2 wetland. There is local debate over whether or not that should move forward, and the agency has been working with the community to try to move that proposal forward, but currently there still is local concern. The select board, I think, at once said, yes, let's move forward with it, and then since changed their mind. I think we will probably go down and have more conversations with the new select board.
Said 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes, you're exactly right, Senator McDonald. It's been going on now for, I think, 4 years. It was immediately pre-pandemic. So, yeah.
The rule came to Elkhart.
Yes, and that's where the
After
concern.
several years of
Exactly
hearings
right.
and et cetera.
Yep.
And on the morning of the hearing, the administration withdrew the rule.
Right.
So I'm,
There was some local opposition was expressed. Yes.
so we are looking at rules that classify waters, and our rules procedure permits the rule makings for the making of rules to carry out statute are subject to local concerns in the last, within, a brinksmanship time, that have the rules simply not be promulgated. And we're talking about the conditions of when rules will be promulgated, but under our current system, it's questionable whether or not they actually get to someone as the gumption. Mr. Chair, I'm writing myself notes here, and I'm going, when your basement begins to fill up with water, there's a device that turns on the sump pump and it drains the water from your basement. And when your house begins to fill up with smoke, there's a device that says, get out of the house. In Burlington, there's when PCBs reach a certain level, kids just are removed from the school. And I know there's an argument going on in Burlington that if we just change the PC level by rule, we wouldn't have to do that stuff. So there's a lot of trust that is in this rulemaking, and not permitting something that violates the floor that has been accepted. Yet when we deal with raw sewage that overflows, that's sure as hell being violated. And we say to ourselves, I don't know, what do we say to ourselves? It continues to go on. So why would we have faith in changing the rules in a system that doesn't enforce them?
Okay, I'm gonna consider that a rhetorical question.
Yeah, it is. It's a trust us. 1,000 gallons was the standard. I don't know if it was a good or a bad standard, but it's what is the 1,000 gallon threshold? A limit that we weren't going to go above. What was wrong with that standard?
Just quickly, Senator McDonald, I would say your Black Gum example was a good example where that 1,000 gallon limitation currently generates local opposition to being able to move forward with it potentially, in some cases warranted, in some cases unwarranted, but regardless generates that local resistance to reclassification because of that standing prohibition. Whereas we would like to be able to move forward more efficiently with reclassifying the water based upon its condition and then protecting it through our permitting system with this new anti-degradation implementation rule. So that's what we're recommending so that we can move reclassifications forward without that local resistance that you remember well from the Black Gum Swamp example. Even though that's a wetland example, it's a similar situation.
It's a standard that we've committed to in statute and have a mechanism to, through rule procedures, to enforce, carry out, implement. And we're not doing it. And we're being asked to use a word I don't like to use, modernize and be more efficient. Does that mean, what does that mean? That we're going to find ways to not hold to account what we said we were going to hold to account?
Yeah, I don't know how to, so, I would like to get back, if we can, not to avoid this question, but
Point taken.
to, the way I think of this proposal is the new rule is that you're proposing a rule that you feel will be more functional than your current rule. And that, and along with moving that rule forward, you would change the threshold that is basically causing resistance at the local level to classifying up, reclassifying up. So there's a bit of an impasse, and I guess, but we'll hear from there's another whole side to this, and we'll get to it. I don't want to go so deep on one piece that we don't keep the big picture in mind, but
I missed the part in there that said that the changing the law would be permit classifying up only.
right, so that's what anti-degradation at heart is. So that part, I think we're square on. Question, but so I'll be blunt about what I'm hearing. We'll hear other people. I'm sort of synthesizing things from all sides over the last few months, and I think the questions I'm hearing are: will these rules actually deliver better water quality for the state of Vermont, the new rules? And if we take away that gallonage limit that will allow for potentially for more development to happen, let's say the rules work fine, but will we see enough reclassification that people will feel like, okay, well, we've opened the door to more development, but we're also going to see potentially 136 bodies of water get reclassified to higher levels. That sort of again, more than just a net gain to the state, because that implies there's a net loss. Is it all gain? And I guess that's the
We feel like
dynamic. I feel like I'm hearing the back and forth over.
we feel like the opportunity to reclassify those waters upward and reset, elevate that floor, that would provide much better protection. We feel like the anti-degradation implementation rules that we are in the process with provides a system of good protections to maintain those higher classes. And that we feel like the 1,000 gallon per day prohibition, you've heard about our experience with it, and also the fact that one size does not fit all. I mean, 1,000 gallon system located close to a river is much different than 1,000 gallon per day system located far away, or a 5,000 gallon per day system located far away from a river. That one number is not, one size does not fit all.
Do you know how old that 1,000 gallon figure is?
It was adopted in 1986.
1986. Great, and I think what will be helpful, but maybe we don't have time to get into it now, is better understanding the permitting process, like the tier 1, 2, 3, and the proposed rule, because I think in part people are being encouraged to say, have faith in that rule, that it's actually going to deliver the kind of outcomes that I think we genuinely are anticipating it will. But I'd say rather than try to dive into the rule, let's schedule time to come back and look at the rule piece. Now, I think my sense is we get the 1,000 gallon, how that statute that does not allow Class A waters to have a septic system over 1,000 gallons a day plays into it. It's like on the side, but very important for the real world reclassification projects, when you have property owners saying, not in my watershed, thank you very much. So we have more to learn. Anything more? So we've jumped in. Senator White, and then I want to make sure that you all have a chance to wrap up what you brought.
Thank you, Chair Bright. Just so I understand, the swamp situation that's wetlands. That's not this.
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to, okay.
Okay.
Because the bog question earlier, I just want to make sure that
Right.
the answer still.
Right.
Okay,
There again, the parallel bit different.
and we're not
Similar.
dealing with this.
We're not dealing with
Okay,
it. That's correct.
Right,
cool.
right. Yeah, if you wanted to increase your mental pain, we would start a wetlands discussion.
You know, based on that description, I'm good. You're good.
Right. So I don't know what else you want to convey to us before, and we will schedule time, because really we should understand the rule more carefully. As I understand, because they're in development in their draft rule, they may have to be adjusted along the way to
That's
Right.
being presented.
And as O'Grady had mentioned, we're in, we just wrapped up the public comment period on that role and are preparing some tweaks to it. So in terms of, that are referenced in the findings of the proposal that we're considering today. And then just to clarify that our intent is to include those on-site wastewater systems, those permits in the applicability section of the rule. So I just wanted to make that point. And then just, remind the committee that right now the waters that we're seeking to reclassify are B2 and have no protections either through the existing prohibition or explicit, in the anti-DEG implementation procedure that we're under now. And so feel that the proposal in terms of looking forward for waters reclassified after July 1st of this year would be able to provide that protection through a site-specific analysis that's proposed.
I think.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I was just going to offer if there's, if the committee would see any value in just quickly walking through the statutory change that's proposed, because there has been, the context has been invaluable, but the statutory language itself is very short, and I think there were a couple of clarifying questions raised in Mr. Brady's walkthrough that we could answer.
Sure, as long as we can do it briefly, because we have other people who want to get, so please, if you jump in, and thanks very much.
Sure.
So there's, as you said, there's a lot of findings here, and let's jump to the working gears in here.
Yeah, a number of findings that largely reflect what's happening through the anti-degradation implementation rule process to ensure protection of the waters. The amendment itself is proposed to 1259B, which currently states that no person shall cause a discharge into Class A waters except for on-site disposal of wastewater from systems with a capacity of 1,000 gallons per day or less. What we're proposing in this committee bill here is that any water that's already classified as A1, that 1,000-gallon limitation would remain in effect. These are primarily high mountain streams over 2,500 feet of elevation. The 1,000-gallon limit remains. For any water that is reclassified as A1 by the agency moving forward, the 1,000-gallon limitation would be lifted. What that means is that systems that discharge more than 1,000 gallons a day potentially would be allowed in Class A watersheds, assuming that they got the appropriate permits issued by the agency. All indirect discharge systems, so that's the on-site wastewater that Mike O'Grady talked about, septic systems, leach field systems, and indirect systems, all are subject to the agency's permitting requirements. These are complex permitting requirements. The wastewater potable water supply rule, which lays out the technical standards for the on-site wastewater, that rule is 240 pages of technical requirements. The indirect rule, which lays out the requirements for indirect systems, is 280 pages long. So these systems do need to get permits. Under the anti-degradation rule, the review of those permits, depending on where they're located in the watershed, might include this tier 2 anti-degradation analysis to ensure that they're not resulting in any degradation to the water quality. The only other amendment to statute that's proposed here is in 1263F, which actually refers to the wastewater permits. It clarifies indirect discharges, how they're permitted under either the indirect rules or the wastewater permitting rules. Fairly straightforward statutory change.
Yes, Senator White.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So is there a project that is, I'm just trying to understand, is there like a hotel on top of a mountain that's trying to be built that can't?
Well, I think that when the 1,000-gallon limitation was adopted, it was effectively a prohibition on development. Ski resorts, for example, are at higher elevations, maybe in the watersheds of A1 streams. That was the thought. Yes, let's avoid development of resort-like or sprawling development.
And this would allow it now.
This would lift the 1,000-gallon prohibition. So potentially, yes, a development that needed a system of more than 1,000 gallons could potentially be permitted by the agency in a Class A1 watershed. Land use restrictions would still apply. Act 250 still applies as a limitation on the development. Setting that aside,
Okay.
The existing A1 watersheds, Class A watersheds would still have the prohibition. In
Yes.
effect. This is only looking forward to waters that are currently B2 with no restriction. So it's not affecting existing A waters going forward. So waters above 2,500 are A, and the prohibition would continue. The few waters that have been reclassified as A below 2,500, the restriction would still be in place. This is looking forward to being able to more effectively do reclassification for waters that are currently B2.
And to your question also, the 11 lakes that Bethany mentioned. So we don't have any lakes in the state currently classified as A1. And lakes tend to have larger watersheds. And so the potential that somebody might be proposing a development that would require a system of more than 1,000 gallons, in theory, would be greater in a lake watershed than a high mountain stream watershed.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the reclassification process you're describing is more likely to allow for a development that's large, that's next to a lake, than it is a high mountain stream when this changed.
And the reclassification process is separate from this 1,000-gallon limitation. So if the 1,000-gallon limitation is lifted, then any water reclassified as A1 moving forward. So that would be anything that's under 2,500 feet of elevation that we might reclassify.
It would allow the potential for for a larger project, but that larger project would have to go through the scrutiny of the anti-DAG implementation procedure and the permitting process to ensure the protection of the water quality. That evaluation, we feel, should occur as part of the permitting process.
And you're making the risk calculation that this is a worthwhile change because there's all of the, I mean, maybe I'm not supposed to be asking your opinion on this, but based on the question I've asked, I don't feel like it's worth the risk. But are you just telling me this is a streamline of the process with the same outcome?
So I think that it's important to understand that the permitting requirements associated with onsite wastewater and indirect are designed to prevent any discharge to the
Yeah,
surface water.
yeah.
So
Okay.
allowing for those systems to be built doesn't mean that there's going to be degradation to the water. That's why we review the permits before they're issued, to ensure that they will actually prevent discharges.
And that has worked.
We have these
Yes.
systems in that the watershed with the 125 streams and the 11 lakes that are currently meeting the criteria but have not been.
I mean, this is helping me feel more comfortable because I am very concerned, as I'm sure everyone is on this committee, with water quality. And I don't like the idea of us lowering any standards. And what I'm hearing from you is that this is not a lowering of standards, but rather possibly a shifting to allow for a better process. And we still have all of the things that make it clear that there will not be degradation to our waters.
That's
Is that
exactly
the, okay,
And
I'm
the
hearing it.
I guess the third thing I would say, the final thing I would say is that it also provides the opportunity for us to upgrade
Go,
to
oh, with the
provide the
streams.
better protection.
Great,
And streams and lakes.
thank you. Very,
Senator Watson and Senator McCollum.
light bulbs coming.
Thank you. So I'm also in that space of like, okay, I'm standing there like, get this. So just reading through what is here though. So this is not, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but the fact that we can now reclassify waters is not in here, right? Like that's a federal thing?
That is it's in state statute.
Okay.
The agency's ability to reclassify based on an evaluation of the current condition of the water. This doesn't change that. We have that ability. This is intended to make it easier for us to reclassify lakes below 2,500 feet without the chilling effect of this 1,000-gallon prohibition in place.
Okay, so like and is that because of the public process that happens around the reclassification? Okay, so if we are hoping for reclassification to happen, having this provision in here it's going to help, basically. It's going to help with that public process.
Removing our recommendation is that removing that existing prohibition clears the reclassification process to focus singularly on the quality
I
of the water
see.
measurements.
Okay.
And we would slot waters accordingly without the
Got you.
drag of the 1,000-gallon prohibition coming along with it,
Okay,
causing local concern.
got you. I think it's crystallizing. Thank you. I appreciate this.
Senator McCollum.
So going forward, if I understand correctly, going forward, waters can be reclassified to a higher class. But the higher class does not have the same level of protection it used to have.
Arguably, it has the level of protection based on our permitting standards, does not have a 1,000-gallon upper prohibition on the size of an indirect system that could be
Well,
built.
that 1,000-gallon limit, that was a protection, right?
It may have been
Yeah.
intended as a protection, but it was a poor fit. Again, if you look at the entirety of a watershed, a 10, 20, 30 square mile watershed, there are many places within that watershed, many places within that watershed where a 1,000-gallon system would have absolutely no measurable effect, especially given our modern permitting standards on water quality. In fact, as Hannah was saying a few moments ago, our criteria or permitting requirements are to have to build a system to have no effect on receiving water. So the 1,000-gallon prohibition was a sort of an arbitrary number, if you will. And we feel like with our anti-degradation implementation rule, the new rule that's moving forward that would accompany this, that the protections, the limits, the oversight that's called for in there would be a better system across all of our permit types. Not only, right now, the only prohibition is 1,000-gallon system. Our anti-degradation implementation rule would affect all of our permits.
So you're,
Stormwater permits, stream permits. I mean, there are a number of different permitting activities that could go on in the watershed.
so you would be looking at 1,000 gallons refers to the size
It's the
of the
number of
system.
gallons.
And what you want to look at is more of the effectiveness of a system.
The potential impact of any proposal that requires a permit in each watershed, whether it's a stormwater permit or a 1,000-gallon system or a 500-gallon system or a 2,000-gallon system, et cetera. So evaluating, looking at the size, the location, the scale of that system, and evaluating whether it's going to have an impact on the receiving water is sort of the subject of the rule. And we feel like that's a better system. We reclassify based upon what the water quality is and then protect that water quality through a protective rule.
So we'll have to schedule more time to come back and actually dig into the rule itself.
Yes.
Because in a way, we're looking at saying, oh, well, if the rule can outperform the current permitting in combination with this 1,000-gallon limit, let's understand what system we're swapping for what. And we don't have time to get into that level of detail this morning. Can I just really, before going to Senator McDonald, what's the significance of 6,500?
6,500 is the threshold above which you need an indirect discharge permit versus a wastewater permit.
Okay.
Both
Is that
of those,
existing statute?
it is actually, yes.
Okay.
It's in
So
chapter.
greater than 60, greater than or equal to 65 is an indirect discharge.
Mhm.
Okay.
They both permits on either side of that threshold seek to have water go down into the ground. And it's an administrative differentiation between a wastewater permit, less than 6,500, that's one permitting program, and the indirect program, which is greater than 6,500. Their rules are similar in a lot of ways, but the indirect system rules contemplate a number of different type systems, whereas the on-site rules are your typical septic system.
The nomenclature is a little confusing.
Yeah.
They're all
Yes, it
indirect
is.
systems.
Right.
One rule is called the indirect discharge rule. The other rule is the wastewater potable water supply system rule.
But they're all indirect systems.
Can you, and as part of a next visit, can you make a simple chart that says gallonage, like maybe water quality and what kind of permit? I don't know if we can leave the water, the water quality level out of it if you like, but just so we can see the tiers, and then we can also get into your tiered permitting system.
I think we could come up with some infographics. for you.
Oh, infographics, that's, yeah, any infographic that's on a single page is
Yeah.
helpful. All right, Senator McDonald, you got a question?
Our agriculture practices subject to anti-degradation.
No, it's a very good question, Senator McDonald. No, they do not require compliance with the water quality standards. So permits that require compliance with the water quality standards index through the portion of the water quality standards, the anti-degradation policy. So typically permits issued by the Agency of Natural Resources. And we have a collection of those permits that would go through the anti-deg process. The RAPs are not one of those.
And the
I know the permits granted based on the size of numbers of animals of the different farms.
The LFO, MFO, and small farm permits are all permits issued by the Agency of Agriculture that again don't require specific compliance with the standards. They seek to prevent discharges. Our CAFO permit, our concentrated animal feeding operation permit, is the NIPDES and NPDES federal permit that we issue in place of the EPA. That does require compliance with anti-deg.
And are those different farm operations that you described based on size?
They are, that's correct, animal numbers, yes.
So, which some would say were no more or no less arbitrary than the septic systems used to prevent degradation.
Right, they're rough sliding of the impact of the potential impact of a farm on discharge. So they're right. I'm not sure exactly how the animal numbers were chosen in the first place.
I was on the conference committee that picked the 1,000, and it was
Okay,
with the disagreement between the House and the Senate on that.
I'm sure.
And it was agreed on, and so someone said 86.
Yes.
Strikes me as incorrect.
And what were the two proposals? 1,000 was a compromise?
Yeah.
All right, so thanks for getting us further down the road on seeing how this whole thing works. To folks that have been patiently waiting your turn, don't worry, you're not gonna be asked to do all your testimony in 13 minutes.
We can
We'll,
do it.
we will schedule and reschedule to make sure everyone gets ample time to present their side. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to go to, actually, Mr. Carpenter's not in the room, so, Mr. Overstreet, would you like to go?
We're gonna go together.
Okay.
Can we have a break in the, before we go? Would that be okay? I think, it's been a long morning for everybody on anti-degradation. I personally could use to go to the bathroom, but
We have a break
We
at
have a break
10:30.
at 10:30.
Yeah.
you wanna go, because we're gonna do this together, all right?
All right, well.
Yes,
I don't know that we could do it in 10 minutes. I was
No, no, no,
really joking.
Yeah.
We will continue after the break.
Yeah, I scheduled
So
something
if you
for
want
10
to.
minutes. so.
No, I'm not
I don't want to see
gonna,
you squirming.
no, I'm not gonna miss the opportunity.
You know,
Okay, we need to use the bathroom.
I live in East.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start, and obviously we're gonna go over, and our guests who are gonna be on the other side of the break will also shift back. So let's get going. We'll spend some time, we'll take our break, and then you'll be back in the chair when we come back from break.
Okay, great. Well, just for the record, my name is John Groveman. I'm the Policy and Water Program Director for Vermont Natural Resources Council. And I'm here with Mason. Mason, just go on record.
I'm Mason Overstreet. I'm a staff attorney with Conservation Law Foundation Vermont.
So CLF and DNRC and Lake Champlain Committee, that's Jared Carpenter, who's not in the room because he's in Senate Ag dealing with another water issue. So we've been on the stakeholder group that you heard mentioned earlier. And I've been working on the proposed anti-degradation rule together. And it's been a great partnership. And so what we're here to do today is to present. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly because a lot's been covered by Attorney O'Grady and the agency about anti-deg kind of the overview from our perspective. I've made some notes. I'm just going to try to hit some of the points you've already heard about and just kind of give you like our view of some of these issues to help you with the context in addressing this issue. And then Mason's going to go through specific recommendations if you're going to move forward with the legislation, what we would think would need to be in legislation if you're going to move forward to make sure we protect these high quality waters. So
Great. And let's plan on half an hour. So we'll go 10, take that break, then we'll come back with the balance. You'll have 20 more minutes to move back.
yeah, I don't think we need half hour. We'll see. Maybe we could fill it. So
You don't have to fill it.
I know, I'm just kidding. So the NRC has been working on this issue of anti-degradation literally for decades. Because I think you saw from Attorney O'Grady, since 2004, we've been having these debates about should we have a rule, should we have a procedure, how are we implementing this important policy. I personally, just to kind of give you kind of my background that's relevant to this issue, I've been working on the issue longer than that, probably for almost 30 years. Most relevant was When I was general counsel at A&R, we took a run at this and didn't get over the finish line. I was the executive director of the Vermont Water Resources Board. When the Vermont Water Resources Board had the responsibility for actually adopting the water quality standards and doing the triennial review, also adopting the wetlands rules. That board was eliminated in 2004, and all those authorities were transferred to A&R. I took over at the Water Resources Board from Bill Bartlett, and I know that some of you know who Bill was. Bill was, he unfortunately passed away fairly recently, and Bill was a great person, but I think the strongest advocate for water quality that Vermont has probably ever had. And when I had the privilege of taking over the Water Resources Board from Bill, he sat me down. I got a first meeting, kind of like doing the transfer, here's, what's going on. And he said to me, John, he goes, whatever else you work on, the most important water quality policy is anti-degradation. And I said, what do you mean by that? I knew a little bit about it, but not as much as Bill. So this has been, and that was, I think, in, that was the year like 2000. So that was kind of my first real introduction to how important this issue is. So I just want to help put this in a little bit of context.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
So if it's been under discussion for a long time.
Yeah.
Are you satisfied with the status quo?
No, the status quo is not good. We're not classifying waters, and I'll get to a little bit about, we have talked a little bit about that this morning, but I do want to kind of provide our perspective on why we are not and have not been. It's not just now, it's been basically since the Clean Water Act in 1970. I think you heard the Class A waters we have are almost entirely, there's a few that were recently classified, but most of them above 2,500 feet. That was by statute. But we really have not classified waters. There are no B1 waters. So we haven't had the B1 classification for as long as we've had the A classification, but there is 0 B1 waters. So we're not doing the classifications. And then as I was going to talk a little bit about the procedure, the interim procedure to implement anti-degradation, we believe is not effective at protecting.
Sure.
high
Well,
quality.
the reason I asked the status quo question is just to see if, make sure that like we know that like all parties are actually interested in making progress on it, as opposed to whether or not people would actually prefer the status quo.
Yeah, and I do want to say, I want to say that regardless of the timing of this and how long we've been talking about it, A&R's efforts to have the stakeholder group and move forward the anti-degradation rule has been an excellent effort. And it was a really, A&R put a lot of effort into it. I think we had a good stakeholder group that represented a lot of perspectives. Like I said, VNRC, Lake Champlain Committee, CLF was on the stakeholder group, but there were business interests, municipal interests on the group. We had an excellent discussion over, it seemed like it was a year, it was a year? Yeah, it was over a year. So I want to give A&R credit for that. And I think that will improve the status quo. We agree with that. And while we have some comments on the rule that we filed and some improvements we'd like to see, and I'll reference some of those today, but this is not focused on the rule, it would definitely move things forward. And I think A&R has done a really great job with, and one thing that Attorney O'Grady didn't say is it wasn't us agitating as an environmental community for A&R to restart this effort. It was actually you, Mr. Chair, I believe, who wrote a letter.
A letter.
Yes, and so did the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee saying, we need this rule and statute requires it. And so you get credit for that, and you're part of this. You have, I don't know what adjective I want to use there.
Yeah. Well, I think we should stay away from adjectives.
Right.
A and adverbs both.
So I do want to say that, and so just getting back to sort of the context here, trying to hear what you've heard and what I could add to this before Mason dives into the details. So anti-degradation comes from the Clean Water Act. The policies in the Clean Water Act has been there since 1970. So it's not a new thing as a policy. And I really I think taking a step back and thinking about what you're gonna do with any bill, the framers of the Clean Water Act, it was quite incredible. They basically had the vision in 1970 to say, we have all this pollution. Obviously, the Clean Water Act came out of the river on fire, the Cuyahoga River, all the terrible water quality problems we're having. But they also said we have some incredibly pristine, high quality waters. And the Clean Water Act says the goal of the act is to restore, maintain, and enhance these waters, right? So that was right in the federal law. And it made its way into the EPA regulations about water quality standards. And EPA said every state needs to have water quality standards. Part of those standards needs to be classifying waters, as we've discussed today. So we need to know which waters are high quality and which waters, what are the uses in the various waters. And then EPA said, consistent with the Clean Water Act, every water quality standard has to have this anti-degradation policy. So we do not, once we identify these higher quality waters, we don't lose those. And we don't see them degraded, even though the Clean Water Act also authorizes the issuance of permits. And that was talked about today, right? You can get permits. You all know that. You've already heard that this session. You could apply for NPDES wastewater permits. You could have applied for stormwater permits. But the management goals is still you have to manage those high quality waters and not degrade them. So I just wanted to, I think that's an important context for this conversation.
Can I just double check? So Mr. Grady had a slide and he cites section 29A 105. I'm not sure where we are, typo there. But it says all water shall be managed in accordance with these rules, protect, maintain, and improve water quality. So that's a direct, as part of our delegation. Clean Water Act flows comes to Vermont through delegation, and we inherit those three things right there.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, that's every state. That's not a Vermont unique thing. That's not unique for Vermont. That's every state's obligation. So, to the status quo question, really the next point I wanted to make is that, the existing procedure, the philosophy behind it is basically that you can get permits to discharge to waters, and we have standards and permit requirements. And the way I read the existing procedure is that the presumption is that if you meet those permitting standards, you're not going to degrade the waters, and that's how we function today. So there is a anti-degradation analysis when you get a permit, but it kind of loops you to the procedure, and the procedure says if you meet our standards, we don't think you're going to degrade the waters. VNRC and CLF and Lake Champlain Committee has never really agreed with that. And that was really a big part of the anti-degradation rule discussion, is to say that, for the B2 waters, as you heard from Bethany, those are most of our waters, and those are sort of our main stem waters and the tributaries that feed those waters. That's probably true. I would agree that that is probably true, that when you get your permit, you're maintaining that B2, you're not degrading that B2 water below and actually falling into a polluted water that doesn't meet water quality standards. But the conversation we had during the anti-degradation stakeholder group looking at the proposed rule was that for the very high quality waters, and that's something you're going to hear us talk about, that those ordinary permit standards may not be enough. And this is where we really agree with ANR, based on the location of our project and the scale of the project, and its potential impact on the waters. We need to do a little bit, we need to do more than just rely on those standards. So,
question. So when you say rely on those standards, does this go back to, if you, under the current procedure, if you get a permit and you're presumed not to degrade?
Yes, that's right.
I get that right? Okay.
That's pretty much that you put your finger on it,
And
right?
are you saying then that the current permitting system is inadequate to ensure that?
For these very high quality waters. And I think that's the philosophy behind the proposed rule. I believe that we have agreement on that, and that's why the rule, I think the core agreement we have in the rule is that we're going to have this individual site specific review to do like a double check on whether those ordinary permitting requirements and that presumption that you just referenced holds true.
Okay.
We're going to do a real check-in.
And so the rule that we're going to dig into on a future visit, the question is, do we end up agreeing that that's a better permitting system with better outcomes. And then we would agree to, I don't know how, if you're gonna propose, if you're also going to propose changes to the rule, and if at the same time, you're also gonna look for statutory changes, because they do operate one relative to the other.
Right. I mean, I think you'll see, I'm just trying to give you the context here. You know, yeah.
Maybe we take our break at the 10:30 break now.
Yeah, or you can,
No, this is a fine time to break.
Hey, good
Yeah.
time. You-
Yeah. I wanted a break before, so I want a break now.
Yes.